in the early part of the century, especially, last century, 1900s,
Right.
was a kind of place where it was called a boomtown because people came and then people left and it collapsed. So in a
Right.
sense, you're fortunate that when you went to Prince George, that it was a boomtown and remained, at least in your estimation, a boomtown. That's not typical what people think of when they think of boomtowns.
No. But we've seen the same in Alberta, actually, next to us in Fort
Mm.
McMurray is the oil sands, and probably estimated to be the largest source of oil in North America, in a different way, and that became a major boom town, but still is subject to prices of oil and all of that kind of stuff. Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. And for all those people that are watching us from around the world, they say, yeah, we know where Canada is, and British Columbia on the west coast, right? Right. And we have a big city there in British Columbia called Vancouver. We are 500 miles north of Vancouver, or for our European friends, 800 kilometers. And it is nature's paradise. Lots of trees, lots of lakes, and lots of other friends, black bears, grizzlies, caribou, deer, wolves, you name it, we have it all here. Today we got a very, very interesting guest. His name is Jonathan Bernstein, and Jonathan is an author, an entrepreneur, and a devoted father with a passion for storytelling that makes an impact. He's the author of 2 codes, and that'd be interesting to talk about that part, obviously, and Election Day, both illustrated by Natalia Berezina, using the power of visual storytelling to engage and inspire readers. Born in New York City and raised in San Francisco, Jonathan now calls Portland, Oregon. I love Portland, Oregon, home. He's also a scholar. Jonathan has a PhD in literature from Yale University and has spent a lifetime immersed in European languages and cultures. I'm very interested in that part because I was born in Europe, and in fact, I was born in Holland. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
So, what brought you, you were, tell us right from the beginning, you were born where, and as part of the introduction, and then you went to different areas, and then you took literature in Yale University. So how did you, where you were born, and then obviously had an interest in becoming an author, or what was your career before you made the decision to go in that direction?
Well, that's an open question for sure. As you correctly point out, I grew up in San Francisco. I was born in New York, but my parents quickly moved to San Francisco. My father was a professor there, and we had a lot of kids in my family. There were 4 kids, and it was hard to get attention. And the way I got attention was being good at languages. So early on, I studied German and French, and then later studied Russian.
Oh
And so
my.
when it came time to choose a profession, it was easy for me to sort of go from my interest into a profession. And I'd always thought about being a writer, an author, but because of circumstances that happen to people who are ambitious when they're young, I found myself moving in an academic direction, which was really not in my initial concept. So it's taken me a while to come back to this I'd say authorial role, or this role, rather than be a reader, become a writer, and that's sort of what this this is about now, is writing books and getting out other cultural products, films, and so on.
So what makes it so interesting is that your languages, in particular, was an area of interest already at a fairly young age, really. When you were in school or in university, and so to speak German, Russian, and a number of other languages. Did you see that as a challenge, or did you want to explore more about the people that spoke that languages and the countries behind it? And the European interest in particular is something obviously that I'm familiar with because I was born in Holland and lived there until I was 23 years old before I moved to Canada.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you grew up in San Francisco in the 80s, when I did, you're dealing with a city that's quite liberal at the time.
Yeah.
And my parents were hippies and they were quite liberal. And I thought perhaps that they didn't have the right idea entirely. But my initial concept was not that they didn't have the right idea because they were too far to the left and I had to go right. My initial idea was they were too far to the right and I had to go left. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to see the Soviet countries myself and see really what that communist paradise was like. Because you see, you never know when it comes to the media if they are telling the truth. And I never met anybody who'd been to Eastern Germany or to Russia or to Poland or to Bulgaria. I mean, there are sort of reports, and you could read newspapers. But my thought was that maybe there's this larger American conspiracy, and the promised land is actually in some kind of post-Stalinist utopian world. And I didn't, it took me a long time to get that out of my head. I actually had to go study at the Humboldt University. I studied Marxism and Leninism at the Humboldt University just as the wall was falling. And then, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The Humboldt University is where?
It's in Berlin.
Berlin, yeah, okay.
It's actually the oldest university in Europe.
Eastern Berlin.
Well, now there's only one. Yes, at the time it was certainly in the East. But the Humboldt University is one of the most storied universities in the world classically. I mean, Germany has Göttingen, which is always been in the West, and great tradition with Goethe and most of the European, the great German writers and philosophers passed through there. Passed through Weimar, of course, Goethe. But there's also always been the Humboldt Universität. Humboldt Universität heißt das auf Deutsch, and that is ambition. Yeah. So anyway, so that was my intention. So I went and I studied Marxism and Leninism at a time when it was very unfashionable. Of course, it's still quite unfashionable. But shortly after, and while I was there, while I was in Berlin studying, the wall fell. So this was 1989.
Yeah.
So that was kind of an awakening as far as what for me as far as what maybe the realities were beyond what I might have imagined them to be.
Yeah. And so I remember this well. And so where you went through this period in the 80s, going up to that point when the wall fell, but wanted to know more about it, in particular Eastern Europe, that was aligned then by Russia and including Eastern Germany up until 89, when, what was the name of the president? It was on my mind here, he passed away.
Honecker.
Yeah, that exactly. And so for me, growing up in Europe till I was 23, is that Europe, even countries like Holland, relatively small, has a lot of history going all the way back to like our family line goes all the way back to the 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
And so and beyond. And then Right next door is Germany, and then south of that is Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Spain, Portugal, and all of those have such an amazing history, that where, and I was watching on YouTube, I think, where they did a very quick looking at the map of Europe and seeing how it changed by the dominant powers, and it would go over and over and over, all around the line, including Holland. And for the guests that are watching us, what I always remember about Holland, what made it unique, it is small, but very industrious actually. But the interesting part about Holland was that Holland is a delta more or less, and where the major rivers come from Central Europe through Holland into the North Sea, south of the major rivers is predominantly Catholic, north of the rivers is predominantly Protestant, and so in saying why? Well, the why was simply because during all the time of all the different dominant areas that we were controlled by Spain, Portugal, France, Morocco, and on all the other ones were predominantly Catholic. And so, and why then the south of Holland being predominantly Catholic and the north being Protestant? Because they couldn't cross the rivers. That's the reason. And so, and that's still the case now to a great extent, a substantial extent. But it kind of shows us how even in a small country and then going into the other countries, how diverse they are and different. And then for me, leaving from there, so I appreciate your statement and your interest, because then I go to Canada and it is all the different cultures and all the different people from all different parts of the world together. It is a mosaic of differences, and to a certain extent even more so newer than obviously the United States. I believe the United States the Constitution is about 238 years old, I believe, or something like that. But Canada even less so, and and it's a mosaic even now still, but it was totally different from Europe, and that what made it interesting to me, coming from the cultures and then seeing the mosaic here of all the differences all in one.
Well, what's fascinating about your journey is that you left Europe and came to, I don't know a lot about Prince Edward Island, and I understand you're saying there are many cultures there, but it's not known as a cultural center within North America. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, right? It's not New York City, and it's not, LA or something. It's more of an area that's not well developed culturally, like Portland, in fact.
Right.
Whereas I kind of went the opposite direction. I left, the U.S., which is, not as old as you say as Europe, with conflicts that are newer and with this, enormous geographic difference, and probably one of the places where, while there may be more Catholicism in the South than the United States, it's nothing like what you find in Europe, which, as you describe, is universal in just about every European country. You go south, you see the Catholics. You go north, you see the Protestants. And if you go far north enough, like to Sweden, you just don't see any more Catholics at all, right?
Exactly.
So, and if you go south enough, everybody's Catholic. So you really kind of you hopscotched away from that, when you came to Canada, and it may be the case that had you been in my situation, you would have found yourself going to Europe.
Exactly.
Because underneath both those journeys is an impulse to find something else and discover something else. And I think that's what makes your story and mine common.
Yeah. So what I did in July of 1965, I made a decision to leave Holland, which was not easy because we are very much, I come from a family that was still very much, when I grew up, living in a cluster of about 10, 20 kilometers maybe apart. So everybody was there. And as soon as you moved out of that circle, they would say, oh my God, John is moving all the way there, 200 kilometers away, and we'll never see him anymore, and this, and not going to the other side of the world. So what I did is I decided, although after the Second World War, a lot of people left Europe, and in particular western side of Europe, and went to either United States or to Canada, that wave, but most of that had stopped for those reasons of fear of Russians taking over after the Second World War, Western Europe. That had stopped in 1965, and immigration had changed quite a bit. And so when I decided to go to British Columbia, the west coast of Canada, was a whole new experience for me, because it was then even more so than Eastern Canada. Quebec, Ontario, and the islands there had been longer established, but the West, British Columbia, Alberta, less so the prairies, were relatively new and emerging. And then I ended up in a city called Prince George 60 years ago. That's where I am today. Be sitting in Prince George. I look out of the window here, I still see the Greyhound station where I arrived from Vancouver with my suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, and I counted my money at least 3 times because I had a dream to build a lumber mill, and they told me, that when I traveled across Canada, I couldn't speak the language, didn't know soul, didn't have a job, and ended up in Vancouver. Went to the immigration office. I didn't speak English, but fortunately there was a German fella. I could speak a little bit of German. Told him what I wanted to do. He said, go to Prince George. That's a boomtown. So I did that. On the bus, suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes. I counted my money at least 3 times. I had $25.47, but I had positive attitude. I always avoid negative, no matter how tough today is. I know it's a better day tomorrow. And then passion, whatever I do, I give it 125%. Work ethic. Even today, I'm 84, just turned 84 about 3 weeks ago. And I still get up at 5:30 in the morning. I always make my bed, and I always think I'm late. and I still have lots of energy and do all of these other things. And so I ended up in Prince George. What was Prince George like, John, in 1965? It was called the Boomtown. Is that if people talk to you, then saying not, the normal question would be, when did you get here and when are you leaving? It was a town where there was lots of sawmills, lots of new investments, and it was a place to make money and then you leave. That has changed in the last 60 years, where we have a great university, the most popular small university in Canada, University of Northern British Columbia, and then the College of New Caledonia. So now it has become a center where it is paradise from my perspective, nature all around us, and that's why, and then British Columbia is a big, big province. We are 500 miles in Prince George, 500 miles north of Vancouver, or 800 kilometers. That puts us in the center of British Columbia, north, south, east, west. So it's a big, big state. And so what I liked about it is that not only is Canada a mosaic, less so, as I said earlier, the islands and then Ontario, Quebec, but in particular British Columbia and Alberta. And then in northern British Columbia, then when I came here, this city was probably 10 or 12,000 people. Now it's 80, 82, and still at the very beginning of exploding and growing. And I have to throw this one in spite of Trump. But, but it still has lots of potential, lots of natural products, and huge potential, and it's still on the verge of expanding even further. It's beautiful from nature, perspective, but also so distinctly different from where I came from.
Well, it must have occurred to you that you switched, one small enclave in Holland for another small enclave in Canada, right? You didn't go on a traveling spree or an adventure. You just changed from one place to the other. But essentially, it sounds like you've lived the same life as all the people who came before you and the rest of your family. You just lived it somewhere else.
Exactly.
And it might be interesting because you say that this is a boomtown. It was a boomtown, and people came and then they were to leave. I've just been reading a book by Daniel Yergin called The Prize, which is quite a good book. It tells the history of oil.
Okay.
And in that book, he talks about how oil would come to a town, be it in Pennsylvania. A lot of wells started in Pennsylvania, later Texas, and there'd be a boom town with a big rush. Tens of thousands of people would come in a matter of weeks. The oil they'd pierce the ground, they'd get a lot of oil out, or not sometimes, and then a few weeks later, maybe a year later, they'd build giant hotels, and a year after that, the town was gone. It was gone. So,
Amazing.
the idea of a boomtown, in the early part of the century, last century, 1900s,
Right.
was a kind of place where it was called a boomtown because people came and then people left and it collapsed. So in a sense, you're fortunate that when you went to Prince George, that it was a boomtown and remained, at least in your estimation, a boomtown. That's not typical what people think of when they think of boomtowns.
No. But we've seen the same in Alberta, actually, next to us. In Fort McMurray is the oil sands, and probably estimated to be the largest source of oil in North America, but in a different way, and that became a major boom town, but still is subject to prices of oil and all of that kind of stuff. But
I read that about that. That's interesting in Alberta, right?
yeah, and if I look forward as well, Jonathan, is that northern British Columbia, and if you kind of take into perspective that I'm only in the center of British Columbia, there's another 500 miles taking us further to the Yukon border, and then beyond, and then next to us to the left is Alaska. All of that area really, in particular talking about Canada, being northern British Columbia and the Yukon, is not really explored all that much, but a huge amount of resources underground, and I believe there is 10 or 12 gold mines going in north of Prince George alone in northern British Columbia, and numerous other mining companies are looking at investment in the region. So it's still very much in the early stages of being explored by capital around the world as to the area of opportunity.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yes. So that then being said, so I kind of, so then I want to kind of pick up again where you went to Yale and then obtained a PhD in literature, and so become really, really serious about writing. And one of the first books that, correct me if I'm wrong, is Two Goats and Election Day. So so you started writing then already, and then one of the first books that you did, am I correct in saying, was Two Goats?
Right. There's some irony there because these are books that are really, well, at least Two Goats is intended for children. It's not a scholarly book. It's not a novel. It's not an adventure story. It's not a novella. It's not even a short story. It's a children's story. And I wrote this really for my son. What happened is this. So during COVID, my son came to live with me in San Francisco. I was living there at the time, and we were there uninterrupted for 6 months. And during that time, we saw no one. So I never thought I would do that. And I don't think I'll ever do that again. I mean, because we just didn't know. I think a lot of people felt this way. They were worried about this virus and this pandemic, and they didn't know exactly how it was transmitted and so on. And we had the sort of good fortune of having a big house with a lot of land around it. And we were able to really just be isolated from everyone. Now, we did have to get food. That came in the form of Instacart deliveries, which were then very thoroughly washed with soap, every package. And thinking back on it now, it sounds ridiculous. But one of the things that happened was that I just became very close in a kind of an unexpected way to my son. I mean, I'd spent time with him.
How old
but
was he then, Jonathan?
He was 7, or actually, I'm sorry, he was 6. But again,
And
the
what's his
circumstance.
name? What's his name?
My son's name is Leon,
Okay.
and this Leon, right?
Yeah.
And the circumstances are just so odd. Like I say, I've been for a week with a girlfriend or something, but just for 6 months, never seen anybody else. Of course, there was Zoom and there was phone, and we did some of that, but really, it was just this kind of very, very odd situation.
Right.
And so this book, Two Goats, came out of that experience, right? And Two Goats is a story of these two goats, but they are human-like in the sense that they stand up. They're walking. They have goat heads, but they have the rest of their parts look like humans. And they live on this farm, and the farm is isolated from other farms. And they go on adventures every day, and they have a good time, and that's their life, and they play games and so on. And then one day, while they're exploring, they hear these strange sounds, and they don't know what they are. And then the little goat says, "Are those goats? Are those other goats?" And they kind of shout through this fence. And the people say, "Yeah, of course we're goats. You're goats, we're goats. We got a lot of goats." And he said, "Oh, wow, I want to go there. I want to go where all the goats are." And so, this little goat builds a kind of a ramp, jumps over the ramp, and joins all the other goats. But then when he joins the goats, he doesn't like it so well, because the sort of the utopia isn't there anymore. You don't have all these things to eat and all these games to play. Everybody just is so busy, they ignore him. And now
It's
he
like
finds
the
he
real
can't.
world, eh?
It's the real world. Everybody's busy. They carry computers around, but they're goats. But they carry computers and
Yeah.
briefcases. And now he wants to go back, but he can't get back because he has to build a ramp, and he can't build a ramp, and so he has to go through a lot of adversity and difficulty. And finally, he comes back. He builds a ramp. He flies back over, and then he decides to build a ramp that joins the two farms, these two territories, so that then goats can come back and forth. The goats that are in the city environment can come and see what it's like to be in the country, and then he and the big goat, he's the little goat. The big goat can cross over and go into the city. So it's a story about building bridges. It's a story about discovery. It's a story about overcoming adversity, and that's what that book is about. That Two Goats book.
Have you got a copy of the book close to you so you can show it to us?
I do have a copy, actually. Yeah, it's right here.
I just want to share with our. Yeah. So I like the pictures.
Yeah, and there's great pictures. I mean, this was very beautifully illustrated by Natalia. She's written something like 50 other books that she's brilliant illustrator. Here's a picture where they're sleeping together. So you see, I don't know what it says. It says, "I'm cold," said the little goat. "Me too," said the big goat. So they're sleeping on either side of this fence.
Yeah.
And you see the big goat is on the side where all the poppies are and this farm, and you can see the farmhouse in the distance. And the little goat is on the side of the city life, and there's not much to see there. And you see there's no place for the little goat to sleep on the other side, so they have to sleep on either sides of the fence. That's one of them. And then here's where he jumps back, back over the fence. He
I
says,
like the illustrations, that makes the book, right?
absolutely. The illustrations are incredible. Anyway, so
Now, the other part
that's
about it, though, Jonathan, is what
yes, sir.
what message do you want to give people? Because it's not only relating to COVID, it's relating to the difference between the real world and the one that you perceive it may or may not be as you living not directly involved. And I'm thinking, in northern British Columbia, not many people, and so when I go to San Francisco, it's a zoo, and I, so that kind of a thing. What message do you want to send? What were you trying to send with the books, the two codes, and why is it still very relevant today?
Well, exactly. This book doesn't deal with COVID at all. It
No.
just is a description of uh, life in an isolated, very controlled environment where things are pretty good, but in some ways easy, and a journey away from that. So the idea is to encourage children and also adults that it's safe to take risks. It's a good idea to explore, and you're going to be okay, right? I think in your story, you took a risk. You left Europe and came to the U.S. Not everybody can do that, and I think ironically, there's some irony there because it takes a community, often a tight community like the kind you had in Holland, to enable you to reach out, to have the confidence to reach out and go places. And often today in families, there isn't that sense of community, and there isn't that sense of place in the first place to allow people to reach out and take risks. So that's what it's about.
Yeah, one correction, respectfully. I didn't come to the
Yes, sir.
US, I went to Canada.
Right. Yeah. These days, that's an important thing to mention. You got to
Yeah.
make sure people understand that.
No. Yeah, I'm being somewhat tongue in cheek, obviously, but
No,
but
no.
anyway, that's what I did. Yeah. So
Stand for
yeah, no, it's all good. So the other part about it is that, so then from that point forward, and so that's two codes, and I like what you did with the book. I like the illustrations are makes the book, and then the size of the book. Obviously, you gave a lot of thought to that too, because for our guests watching us from around the world, is writing books is not easy. Not even if you have a PhD in literature from Yale. Still, it's a challenge to write books, and to make them attractive and to tell the story and the underlying story, as you so well pointed out. What stimulated you is during the period that you spent with Leon, your 6-year-old, for 6 months being alone, that inspired you to write it. Nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with the period, which likely will never happen again like that, but it still applies to today. The underlying principle of it is important, that you must take chances, and if you do, you probably will get value out of it by doing it. Now, the other book, Election Day, is that the other book that you have written?
That's the other book I wrote with the same illustrator. And that book um, is a different kind of book. This
Have you got a
book,
copy of it?
I do have a copy. this, book, this book is even bigger. This is giant. This book is uh, 13 inches by 10 inches. This will be the
Why?
biggest book
Is that
in
a,
your.
is that a table topper book?
This will be the biggest book in your library.
Right,
It doesn't even fit in the bookstore shelves. It's that
right,
big.
right.
And the reason is, you may know this word in German. The word is Wimmelbuch. Wimmelbuch.
Yeah,
Wimmel in German, it may be a similar word in Dutch, means teeming, as in teeming with life.
yeah,
So you'd say in German, Wimmeln, like the party is teeming with people,
yeah,
Wimmeln. don't know if you have a similar word in Dutch. Do you have that?
Not that I know of, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a little bit obscure of a word, even in German, but it's a
yeah,
word.
yeah.
And this is in the tradition, this book is in the tradition of the Wimmelbuch. Okay.
Okay.
So as a consequence, it's made on artboard, and you see how thick the pages are.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
only 16 pages, 16 pages, very few words.
yeah,
You don't need to get a degree in literature to write this book because there's no words in the book. There are no
yeah.
words. But this is the first page. This book, like, I think it's almost too big to fit on the screen. It's just a giant book. But yeah, we got a lot of interest in this book because we were on television, and a lot of people were interested in this. It's what they call, I don't know if you know Where's Waldo. Have you heard of Where's Waldo?
I heard of it, but I don't relate to it.
Well, it's a book that's popular now where there's a figure called Waldo, and you look for the figure on every page.
Okay,
So you say, where is Waldo? Oh, there he is. He's hiding under a car. That kind of
okay,
stuff.
okay.
And that's why it's big, because you have to look through every page to find the people. Now, in this case, you don't just have one character, you have 16 characters.
Okay,
So you have to find every one of these 16 characters. These are the characters on the back.
right.
And it tells a story of what they do, what each one of these characters do on election day. So in a way, it's a bit like a novel, right? Because you have to follow these individuals during the day. And as you go from page to page, you go later and later in the day. So it starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, then it's 10 o'clock, then it's 12 o'clock, then it's 2 o'clock. So by the end of the day, you know what those people did on election day.
Amazing. So with me, I did books too, and the last one that I'm still working on another one on communications, and this one here, Living Young, Dying Old, and that's a picture of me actually. I'm the oldest competitive bodybuilder in North America at 84.
Is that right?
Yeah, at 84. But what I was going to mention about it is that I've done 4 or 5 books, different ones, starting with Against All Odds is one, and then the other one, ADHD, I'm ADHD, and dyslexia, and finding your passion, and then the other one is, the reason that I show them all is that, so what happens with me, I'm going to write a book, and I wake up in the middle of the night in terms of the title or some other things, elements of it, and I say, I got it. That's what I'm going to do. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and then I say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And then the following morning, so is that what happened to you when you wrote the book, that storytelling or the goats and election day, that you said in the middle of the night you woke up and you said, I'm going to do election day, it's going to be this big and it's going to be this big pages? No. So that's how I relate to my mind in terms of, but your books, both of them are uniquely different in terms of how you conceive them or preserve, how do you put something into a book form. The same apply to the 2 goats, although it is very much still today's reality, but it happened during a special period. What made you write election day and then did it in the way you did, because it's uniquely different, and it must have given a lot of thought, and you didn't have to go to Yale to learn to become a writer of that kind of book.
I'll tell you what, John. I have to credit my son with this as well, because I was talking to him at one point about the election,
He's
and he
now 8
said,
or 10, right?
now he's 10, but
Yeah,
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 it was before this. It was probably, he must have been 8, 7 or 8.
yeah, yeah.
I was talking about the election. He said, well, why don't we just, instead of all this talk, it's too much talk about this, why don't we just make Superman president, and that'll just solve all the problems?
Okay, yeah.
And I said, well, I thought about it for a minute, because that's what you do. You learn to think about things that you wouldn't think of otherwise.
No.
And it turns out that the reason we can't make Superman president anymore that he accepted was that there are no more phone booths.
Yeah.
That there can't really be a Superman handy because there has to be a phone booth handy.
Yeah.
That was what he accepted as the reason. But I started to get, thinking and saying, well, look, in a way, we have a superpower, and that superpower in democracies is the power to vote, right? So we all have to do that and exercise our superpower, then we can all be a bit of Superman even without the phone booths. So, then I did some research and I found out that, I think many people are aware of this, but maybe not fully to the extent which is the case, which is, something very few people vote. I mean, it's 1/3 or something of people who are eligible vote. It's a very small number in the U.S. And one of the reasons why that's the case, I think, is because unlike Canada, and unlike virtually every country in the world, with the exception of, with at least the advanced countries, the OECD countries, with the exception of England, election day is held either on a weekend or on a holiday. But uniquely in the US and England, they don't do that. And so many people just simply can't find their way to the polls, or there's a long line when they get there. And, there's a lot of discussion about mail-in voting. And is that right? So as a consequence, that there isn't really clarity about, getting to the polls. I think it's hard for people. And so, the book is a way about that. It's saying that, what are people doing on election day? What are they doing? If they're not going to the polls, what are they doing? And this book tracks these 15 people, and 6 of them actually vote, which is about what you expect from our actual population.
1/3.
So the book accurately makes an effort to accurately reflect the real situation that we have. So, and people do all kinds of things. I mean, one woman's going to the hair salon that day. One woman's a couple of people going sightseeing, but not everybody's voting, and that's not a priority, in fact. And so we've seen in this election and in previous elections that it does matter, and in some cases, the margin for winning or losing an election is an astonishingly few number of people. So anyway, the book is inspired by that kind of political circumstance, as well as by, just being a book that's fun to read and interesting to read, and a book like few other books that are available, just like I say, because of the size and because of the excellence of the illustrations, and the quality of the book itself is it's very high.
So, what's the underlying, if any, message that you want to send as well?
We like to say, make Election Day a holiday. And we did a campaign for that, to try to get people to have time to vote and bring the U.S. in line with every other country in Europe, for example, with the exception of England.
And
that's the message.
I agree with that 100%, but I would take it one step further, Jonathan. I would make it mandatory. You must vote if you reach the age of voting age, if it is 18 or whatever it is. You must vote. It's an obligation. And I believe that I don't say that because of any particular situation, but by us, it's about the same as it is in the States, that voting is probably around 1/3 in a lot of cases, and in some cases even less than that. So and I believe that voting should be on a holiday or a day that people have availability. But the other part is that the effect and the result of voting is so substantial to everybody that it should be an obligation to have to vote. That's my view.
That's excellent. Yeah, it might be complicated to compel people legally, but I certainly think everybody should vote, and it's kind of absurd that we don't have a situation where that's it's happening.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that if you don't vote, then you put it in jail. I'm simply saying there is an obligation, like there is an obligation, that I should not drive down the highway or down the downtown streets. Not a good comparison, but I'm simply making the at 80 kilometers an hour, or something that there is an obligation for a number of reasons as to why it is mandatory to vote. And I believe that would be better for all of us at all times.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think people take democracy for granted, and I think they also have the view that we're very divided. And in some ways, we are. When I say we, I guess I'm speaking of the U.S. I don't know enough
Canada,
about
same.
Canada
Yeah,
to speak
same.
to that,
Yeah.
but there are many things that we have an astonishing amount of agreement on.
Yes.
And I think those things tend to be forgotten. If you look at uh, the things that people want, they want to live in a safe environment. They want to be able to live in a healthy way. They want to have opportunities for themselves, and they want their children to have a good education. And this is pretty much a universal set of uh, beliefs and views, at least in the West. So, exactly how we represent certain numbers in the Treasury Department, or exactly how we handle the border, these are important issues, but they're sort of, I would think, um, more
Secondary.
on the edge of what people
Yeah.
believe. And the number of very loud voices on the edges, I think, have usurped the common views of the population, at least in politics.
Yeah.
So we really have to be aware of how many things we agree on, and that's must be the same in Canada.
Yeah, and it is, because the ones that you named is the foundation of tranquility, in terms of you have to work hard, do all these other things, and then the result is stability in terms of making sure your kids are okay. There is health care that will take care of you. We take care of those that are less privileged than we are without going too far, where it becomes an incentive not to do anything. But all those fundamentals are important, and they are the same. We're the same in Holland, where I grew up, and in some cases went a bit too far maybe, but all the fundamentals are important, and they're the same between Canada and the United States, are virtually the same in a way, in terms of languages, obviously, but also interaction. I have different companies, and we interact a lot with the United States, virtually on a daily basis. And and I believe that we are collectively very, very fortunate in North America, between the U.S., Canada, and as well as Mexico. That location and all the other benefits that we have collectively. The other question I was going to ask you, though, is that Leon is probably working hard on you to write another book of some sort or another. What is your next book?
We actually have a book planned for Halloween. So just as this book takes election day and says, what are people doing on election day? Another book with essentially the same format, Natalia, again, the illustrator, will be a Halloween, the holiday of Halloween, and show what people do, from morning to evening on Halloween. And our intention is to do a whole series of American holidays. It's called American Holidays, so I guess I would include Canada and Mexico,
Yeah.
all of America, and looks at what people do on these days, and it's somewhat of a parody. If you like Mad Magazine or The Simpsons and Family Guy, it's a bit like that. The humor,
Yeah,
pokes fun at people.
Yeah, what I find interesting is that the relationship that you have built professionally with Natalia Berezina is
Berezina.
very unique in terms of, because it becomes a very, very important part of the book, and where you can, and the books are distinctly different in the areas that it explores, but very meaningful in terms of, and then Leon's involvement as well, or inspiration, play a big role in it. But does that make you, in a way, all the way back to your earlier age when you grew up in San Francisco, or even maybe even New York, is that with three other siblings, the four of you, and that you were trying to find you, and that made you go in a different way than most people would have done, decided to go to Eastern Europe to explore communism and how that worked, and how those different countries interacted, East Berlin or Eastern Germany and all the other occupied countries under the umbrella of the then Russia, and then going as far as going to study and speak Russian and study in the University of Eastern Berlin. It makes you this is just not something, there's something about you that makes you different in that way, and taking that big step to learn to speak the languages, both German and Russia, and wanting to explore rather than relying on information that must have been in the late 70s or 80s. And, then when computers were not as available as it is today, neither is Google, not even touching on AI, which will change the whole world. In addition to that, is that what was it that made you do those things so different than other people did? Because I would not know anybody that would have gone so far, speak German, speak Russian, and to explore it directly in the way that you did.
Well, but your own story, after all, you left Europe for Canada, right? So that would have been about the time when I was doing a lot of that, early 20s. That famous line from Churchill, way over repeated. I'm going to say it here again, just because people think differently when they're 20 and when they're 30. If you're 20, you're not a communist, you have no heart. If you're 30 and you're not a capitalist, you have no brain. I mean, some of that plays a part of this, right?
Yeah.
And you've heard that before. There's some of it that's true. What I think the surprise for me was that June of 1989, I'm inside East Berlin, which was only possible if you were one of the Allies. West Germans could not go to East Berlin.
No.
West Germans could not go into East Germany. I could with an American passport. You could not with a Dutch passport.
No.
You could not with a Canadian passport.
No.
So I went over to East Berlin, and I had a girlfriend who had come from the East, and she hooked me up with her family in the East. And there was only way to get there was, there's no phones or anything. You had to just track them down. You had to just go find them.
Right.
And we all hung out, I remember on a rooftop in East Berlin in June of '89, and they said, there'll never be a revolution here. There's some stuff going on in Prague and, maybe Hungary. Never, ever, ever. Nothing's going to happen here.
No.
Not more than 5 months later, there was no East Germany.
No.
Right. So what I realized then is just the incredible, how difficult it is to really know what's going to happen. And sometimes things happen that nobody can foresee. And I think we still live in that situation today. I don't think people realize it, but that is always where we are.
Does the one thing have an effect is that Ronald Reagan, who was then the president of the United States, made the statement, President Gorbachev, take down that wall?
Well, that was actually, so in '89, Ronald Reagan was out. He had already served 2 terms. It was Bush at that point.
Okay.
But there's no question that Reagan accelerated the defense expenditures mainly, and really pushed hard on Russia, well, the Soviet Union, and that made it hard for them to maintain that parity that they had for so long. Because as the U.S. was spending 5 or 6% of its budget on defense, Russia was spending 25, or the Soviet Union was spending 25 to 30% of its budget on defense. It wasn't sustainable for them. Now, I personally believe that the Cold War was actually a productive time for the U.S., and I don't actually think that, from a purely U.S. standpoint, not necessarily from a Soviet standpoint, and all the people who lived in the Soviet Union, but purely from a U.S. standpoint, to have prolonged the Cold War rather than been so quick to end it would have probably been good for the U.S. So hastening that, I think, may not have been the right policy looking back now, 35 years. Not that that's something we could have foreseen then.
No.
And the other thing about that that's significant is that because of the way it happened, China has become what China has become. If Tiananmen Square had happened after November 9th, 1989, instead of 6 months before November 9th, 1989, you wouldn't have had this, in my opinion, you wouldn't have had this regime that was, be able to hold on to power so long in China. If that makes sense, because
makes sense. Yeah,
Tiananmen Square was sort of the continuation of the power in China, but at that point, exactly, the idea was not that the whole world was in some kind of revolution. So they had that, in a sense, early. If they had it after '89, after November of '89 instead of before November of '89, I think it would have been harder for the Chinese to hang on to power the way they were able to just 6 months earlier.
Yeah,
so,
no question. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Jonathan, this hour went by quickly, and I really enjoyed it. Show us once more your books, and then have you got a website of some sort that you can share with us? That was the 2 goats that you showed us. Or was it
this is Election Day. This is Election Day. The back cover here, right? And there's a website called electiondaybook.com.
Okay.
It's also available on Amazon. It seems like people really enjoy buying things from Amazon. This is the 2 Goats book. I encourage people to
also available on
Amazon, right?
Yeah.
People really like buying things on Amazon, so we found that's the best way to sell them.
I love it, and for all those people watching us, that the watch on our podcast, subscribe to both Jonathan Bernstein's podcast as well as mine, share it with others, like it, and comment on it. Jonathan, we're going to have to do this again at some point, and I'm going to send you 2 of my 4 books that I have, and I'm going to sign them for you, and they again are available on all the classic ones and Audibles and e-books and all the other ones. And the one is Against All Odds is about, it took me a long time to write them, and it's not about the success of John, but rather all the challenges along the way. The one thing that we did not talk about, but I'm proud to say that I am ADHD. I call it a superpower, and I wrote a book about that part. The other one is saying that there is nothing more important to find something to do that you love to do, give it everything you got, and the foundation for me is attitude, passion, work ethic. I get up every morning at 5:30. I always think I'm late, and I wrote a book about that, why it is so important. Living your passion, finding your passion, living the dream, and saying that, hey John, after being in the workforce for more than 70 years. Are you still living the dream? I sure am. And then the other one is fitness, health, going to the gym. That's me. I'm the oldest competitive bodybuilder in North America. I love going to the gym and health. The most important is get vitamin D, sunshine, sleep at least 8-9 hours a day, get exercise, and then eat healthy food. And it's not about age, it's not a number, it's quality of life that counts mentally, physically. It's all very important. So, Jonathan, let's try to do this again. I'm going to send you all these books. I'm going to sign them for you, and then we'll stay in touch.
It's very kind of you. If you send me an address, I'll send you a couple of books as well.
And this podcast will come out later today. We spin them out very, very quickly. There will be no edits to it, and other than to make sure we add your websites and the book covers, so again, let's try to do this again in the future. Jonathan.
That'd be great, John. Thank you for having me. It was really fun to do it.
Thank you very much. And we'll stay in touch. Take care.
You too.